Merry Christmas, everybody, and happy holidays. Welcome back to Need Some Introduction. In today's episode, I will be discussing with my friend Ian the new Disney Plus documentary, Get Back, a really fascinating document about the making of the Let It Be recording sessions back in 1969. Briefly, if you are a Beatles fan, even a minor fan, I think you'll really appreciate this. It's a very long and detailed documentary. The full 3 episodes is almost 9 hours long. But it really puts you in their headspace, really at a moment where the band is starting to dissolve. So really fascinating to see the dynamic between the different members. And a lot of great music here as well. And really just some insight into the creative process. It's very easy to think this music just comes fully formed out of geniuses' minds. But actually, it's pretty painstaking. Making anything is pretty painstaking. Even making this podcast, actually, is pretty time-consuming when you consider it's really just conversations, right? But it's actually more effort than you expect, and it's good to see something that really appreciates that process. The usual calls to action: make sure you subscribe if you want to know when new episodes are available. Some recent episodes, we continue to recap the Dexter New Blood TV show. There's a new episode just tomorrow, or today, I guess, when I'll be posting this. And that recap should be coming out shortly. You may have caught over the weekend, I released a Marvel review roundup, and I'll be having another follow-up Marvel conversation with some friends, digging into Spider-Man, and also discussing the new Matrix movie, which I saw and enjoyed, but I have a feeling it will be very divisive, so I can't wait to have this conversation and feel out some other Matrix fans. It's hard to be a Matrix fan considering it's really that one great movie, right? That first one. But I did like this, probably the best of the sequels, my mini review, but we'll have much to talk about there in that film as well. Available right now on HBO Max and in theaters as well. That conversation will also hopefully be dropping this week. Maybe it'll be not until after the New Year's holiday, considering everyone's schedules, but soon. As always, reach out to me, needsomeintroduction@gmail.com if you have any feedback. And of course, if you think this conversation will be interesting to any of your friends and family, please let them know about us. It's how we grow our audience, primarily from you recommending us to your friends and family. So thanks for listening in. I hope you're having a great holiday weekend, and let's get to the conversation.
We're talking about 14 songs we hope to get.
I've got a feeling.
How many have we already recorded good enough?
No.
None of us has had the idea of what the show's going to be.
I've got a feeling.
I would dig to play on stage, you know. Nobody else wants to do a show.
I think we've got a bit shy.
Oh, no! Yeah!
What could it be, Paul? Something in the way she moves. What attracted me at all?
Just say whatever comes into your head each time. Attracts me like a cauliflower until you get the word, you know.
I mean, I have so many things to say. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Beatles. Obviously, I like their music. Don't really know their career that well, like other than like the actual albums.
Yeah.
And some general biographical information around that. There's some things I discovered because, you know, and so I'm curious to get your feedback on it, given you're a super fan, I think, than I am. But there's so many things I thought about in the show itself. I'm going to actually give you a little technical background on the making of the show, the film. And I think it's kind of like interesting context for the film itself. First of all, this is made by Peter Jackson, Lord of the Rings, etc.
Oh, yeah.
He's always a special effects innovator. He's been throughout his career. And a few years back, he did this documentary, which was very successful. And I think it got an Academy Award nomination also, called They Shall Not Grow Old. Did you hear about this?
I have not, no.
So what he did was they used artificial intelligence to get 8mm films, and some of it is like 4mm film, 4 and 8mm film from World War I. And they used AI and basically blow it up to high definition as the camera is covering this very small area, you know, like kind of following these men walking through the fields and stuff. You know, obviously in the background, you're getting additional detail. So the AI is using that to create the backdrops to these scenes. So these people are being like reconstructed in this space. And that documentary, not only was it, they blew this up to high definition, they showed it in IMAX in 3D. And then they have interviews with these actual people. They found the people in the footage and they found interviews with them. Obviously, they're not alive now. This is World War I, but they found like, you know, BBC interviews and stuff with them. They took all those interviews. So as you're seeing these people like making campfires or whatever, you hear their voices from like 1950s, 60s, retelling their experience of World War I, right? Wow. So it's pretty amazing, you know, that technology. So he's used the same technology here. So I'll actually include it here when I post this, but there's a short YouTube video where he shows what they did. So they took the original 16mm footage And you don't even think about this when you're watching it. Blow it up to like a high definition, like a 4K representation. But what's so crazy about that is taking all this footage that they have available. They're not just taking the footage and blowing it up. They're basically creating a 3D room with them inside of it. So now, like when they're having conversations, they can like move the camera to like George's face as John is talking, because they've reconstructed the whole room in this like space, right?
Wow.
The other amazing thing they did was they used the AI as well to take this single, recording, which is a mono track that they've captured. And what they did was they taught the computer to basically say, this is a human voice. This is John's voice. This is Ringo's voice. This is what a guitar sounds like. And they literally were able to pull that apart into individual tracks. So some of the crazy things they did here is, you probably noticed when you watched that first episode, that there's times when they're like, wait a second, you're recording us? And you see them strumming their guitars. They're basically fighting with each other and playing their instruments at the same time because they don't want the documentarians to hear what they're saying. And that is like crystal clear now because they stripped out all the other noise.
Yeah. That's interesting. Definitely caught my eye at first, was like, okay, this is super sharp.
Right.
So there's some upscaling they had to have done.
Right.
It's not 1969 film quality. Like for like sports or something like that, when that first started going into high definition, it was like, whoa, this is too much. You know what I mean? You're seeing almost too much detail, and then like the contrast was too crazy. And I think this struck a good balance. It didn't hit that weird, like uncanny valley.
I think the reason it's not so jarring when you watch it is when you're seeing it, I don't think he tried to make it look like a high resolution, digitally shot Avengers movie today, for example. I think what they were trying to go for, the style he went with, it looks like Help or something, right? It looks like something that was shot in 35 millimeter back in the 60s. So it's like they upscaled it that much.
Yeah.
What's fascinating about it to me is that he's making a lot of choices, but it's all to serve the experience that you are there in the room with them, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, for me, this is maybe the most interesting thing that comes out of this is, on the one hand, it's someone manipulating the footage incredibly to give you the sense of intimacy that you're in the room hanging out with these guys. And then the question becomes, how much of this is true, but then how much of it is a manipulation, right? Is like a version of truth. But then again, any documentary is a version of truth, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's still pretty incredible that, you think about this technology being used in a way to, maybe this is fake news, in other words, right? Like this,
right.
Like how much of this is true or manipulation. I think he's a true fan, so I think he's trying to make it as pure as possible, but it's almost like it's so well done in its manipulation that you're not even aware that you're being manipulated, right?
Yeah,
but it's pretty
like
interesting.
The Prestige.
Right, right, exactly.
I was listening to it just in like decent speakers, but they did get stereo separation on stuff. You can kind of hear, Ringo's over like behind John's left shoulder. And you got that sense of placement. So it's fascinating to learn how they did that. It's super entertaining so far, even though, I had read a lot of the reactions and stuff already, and people like, how did they get that done when they're just like farting around like the entire time? But I thought that's, in my experience anyways, and not them on par with any of the Beatles or anything like that, but a lot of that just rings true for like a creative process when you're really starting from nothing. It's rare that you'll come in to a situation like that and then 4 different people involved in the dynamic there to just hit the ground running with the 14 ideas or songs that they wanted to get done. So it rang true to me.
Yeah.
One thing that it definitely dispelled, even right at the end there, when George makes his exit, it dispelled.
Spoiler alert! No, just kidding.
It dispelled the that it was all bickering and tension and stuff like that.
Yep.
Which I think, since they actually ended up releasing this, I believe they cut it down to like 80 minutes, and that was post breakup when it was released in any event. And it seemed like it was kind of at that point sort of a throwaway. And, for the fact that it was like never, to my knowledge, I don't think that original was ever like remastered in and of itself or like re-released. The myth that was busted behind that was like, oh, these guys were just like totally sick of each other. And maybe things take that turn a little bit more going forward, but it seemed to me that they still had fun on like a friendly level. I like the way they did the intro too, just to show like how insanely meteoric their rise was.
Yep.
In such a compressed time frame. You know, they're the cute, you know, like a boy band type of thing. It was great that they mentioned, you know, that it wasn't just like some prefab Fab Four. Mm-hmm. They were childhood buddies, and they played their asses off for a number of years before even getting that first record label. You know, the whole Germany, the whole Hamburg period, playing 8 shows a night. So they had chops, and it seems like they're almost like so legendary, and there's so much kind of reverence for them now. We can tend to think that they're just naturally talented, which is obviously the case, but I like how it shows how much work actually went into the beginning of it and throughout. And, you know, putting out that amount of records in that short time span, by the time we get to this, who's the oldest? John, I think, is maybe 29 or 30, not even 30, maybe 30 or thereabouts. That's just insane. And like, I don't have the whole timeline of what they were doing the year prior, 68, but it was a hugely busy year for them as well. I think that was like the Magical Mystery Tour, All You Need Is Love single. Like, they did a bunch of stuff just before they started this in January.
Hey Jude had just come out before this, right? That's what the inspiration for this project, right?
Yeah, that was cool too, because I remembered more the All You Need Is Love was like one of the first universally broadcast television events, which is kind of cool. Yeah, they were going full steam ahead for, you know, a 9-year period essentially. Yeah, dropping multiple albums in some years, in the early days especially, and just being that absurdly famous. And also dealing with the crazy backlash, you know, with John's Jesus comment. All that is so intense. The only kind of blueprint maybe they could see was like an Elvis figure. Yeah. But he was like one guy, which some cases I guess probably made it worse for Elvis that he couldn't diffuse some of that mania around him to 3 other people. All the same, I mean, that amount of work, that high quality, that amount of fame, I could definitely see how you'd kind of get tired of each other. One thing, too, it was an ambitious mistake, but I think really when the whole Apple Corp venture, you know, I get why they did it as far as more creative control, owning masters, branching out into other stuff. It drew their attention away from making music as the Beatles, and all of a sudden, you know, now they're in all these other meetings.
And they seem so uninterested in those conversations, which they, you know, once again, it's very interesting what Jackson's including here in that you have these drawn out conversations. It's not only that they're talking about this specific project, which obviously they are concerned with, like, where are you going to perform? Like, when are you guys going to finish these songs? You're like a week in, you have 2 songs, right? So these are all realistic, pragmatic things they're asking, but also you have that guy going in, they're talking about, oh, we're going to be publishing, you know, your sheet music, and you have to go have dinner with this guy, and you have to go, and like, you see that they're just so not interested in that part of the business. So to your point, it's just yet another distraction and more work for them, right? That they don't want to be doing.
Oh yeah, that I forget the guy's name. James, Dick James, I believe, was the publishing guy.
Yeah. I kept saying they were saying Rick James. I was like, Rick James. Yeah, Dick James. That'd be something, right?
That conversation was pretty entertaining, and especially when it kind of breaks up and he follows Paul over to the piano. And he's like talking about how in 10 years, you know, it's going to be consistent. And Paul's just like glazed over, you know, could not care any less. Another thing that kind of impression that I had, I don't know if it was George kind of just emoting this to make a point or if it was really genuine. His lack of confidence or seeming lack of confidence was something that kind of jumped out to me. Yep. More than once. In the first episode, he's like, well, most of my songs are slow. It'll just be shit if we do this one. I don't care if we do this. that type of attitude.
But he obviously does care, though, right? It's like
yeah. So I think he was kind of like taking the piss out of himself to just make a point and kind of reflect how he feels he's being treated. But it was still kind of weird to see. And the little bit about Clapton, when he was talking about Clapton and really going like gushing about him, that was interesting too, because I've read that after, I want to say, Rubber Soul, there really were less and less George guitar moments. He kind of went away from that and pursued more of the Indian style songs were his. And like the biggest song of his on the White Album, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, is Eric Clapton playing
Clapton,
guitar.
right?
And he also says he's lost confidence. And you know, there's pretty decent evidence to point to that. Yeah, he kind of started learning sitar. He kind of got away from playing rock and roll guitar like on his own, and it was just hadn't moved him at the way that it did, you know, in the earlier phase of his career.
What do you think about Paul, though? Paul's a little passive aggressive here. It's funny because Paul's actually said this in recent interviews. He says watching it he was afraid to watch it because he thought he had kind of been a jerk during that recording session, and it made him feel like he wasn't as much of a jerk as he thought. But if I was going to call anyone a jerk, specifically in that first episode, by the way, because I think he's much better later on, that when they bring George back, spoiler alert, everybody, when he brings George back, of course he comes back. You know, they made 2 more albums, so he had to come back. They were much more collaborative with him because they could see his frustration. He's criticizing his playing. He goes, don't play the obvious thing or the corny thing. And then John's just saying, just let him play the corny thing. And then, you know, once we get through it, we'll figure it out. But it's like, it's almost the way he's saying that you're playing the same thing again. And I think that's when George starts to be like, you know what, to that point, when he doesn't show up the next day, they're like, hey, if we need to, we'll bring Clapton in. So it's like, it's pretty messed up.
Yeah, really, the box of George is it's them versus John and Paul when it comes to what they want to do and what they want to play.
Yeah.
And if you try doing that for a few months, you're going to end up pissed off.
Yeah.
With the songwriting, say our songwriting team, and he's his own team. And if he's not working on his own stuff.
Yes, but John and Paul aren't writing together much anymore, are they, really?
Yeah, but nevertheless, there's still a team.
Yeah, because it goes on the label that way.
So, cats and kittens, what are we going to do?
Hey, I've just been having some groovy ideas. So what's our next move?
We split George's instruments.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, that was my takeaway, too. George just being frustrated, I think, with the general situation, his position in the band, then having this tone taken with him, and then just the impracticalities, because really, when you look at it, the project timeline is absurd. It really doesn't make any sense. Even if you are even though they did Meet the Beatles, I think, in one day, you know what I mean?
Right.
But, you know, this isn't then the multimedia tie-in aspect, all the logistical things. What's his name? Michael Lindsay-Hogg, who's a total dweeb. Right. That guy, you know, I think he's definitely, he's almost like a stereotypical kind of like managerial figure. Oh, there's this one of the first go-arounds about where they're going to perform after they kind of first rebuff like the whole, let's go to friggin' Tripoli and play in an amphitheater, and he keeps talking about 2,000 Arabs and friends. Like
holding torches.
Yeah, it's like, oh my God. There's this one portion where he's like, oh, so what's the most charitable thing someone can do? And not polio. I mean, something else, like kids with broken legs. And then he's talking about a hospital, and you can see it zooms in on John's face, and he's like, what the hell is this guy's problem? And then when he mentions orphanages, the daggers from John's eyes turn. He smiles, but that is a toothy, sharp tooth grin.
That was what it was like back then, right? Paul like kind of diverts the conversation. He goes, oh, you know, the whole orphanages and hospital thing is kind of like played out or whatever. The way he says that, it almost sounds like that's like a standard thing, right? Where you have like a band goes and whatever, does a charity, you know, they do a ball for some charity or something, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like it seems like it's a you know, perfunctory thing, which is funny for us to think back on that, you have like the Beatles, right? The Beatles, which of course are still one of the most famous bands in the world, even to this very day. But to think that at the time it was like, because this is just the machine, that people are like, yeah, that's what these bands do, right? You go and you do like a little charity ball or something, right?
Yeah.
But I also think the spectacle of it is funny because they're talking about those two things at the same time. So on the one hand, they're saying this is the Beatles. We're going to have this, like a live at Red Rocks type moment, right? And then on the other hand, they're like saying like, or an orphanage maybe.
Yeah. And then what they kind of ended up happening, which is alluded to a little bit, kind of like type of like viral marketing or guerrilla marketing that has really been more in the mainstream over the last 20 years when Paul's talking about, well, we go someplace that we're not supposed to be, we trespass, we get arrested, and that'll be the thing. And, you flash forward to, what was it, one of the Democratic National Conventions, I think maybe in 2008, where like Rage Against the Machine did something similar, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it was interesting that was like an idea, which eventually is kind of what they did without the without the danger of them getting actually hauled off to prison by virtue of being out of reach. Yeah.
Right.
And to me, one of the other interesting things, which again, I don't know how much this changes, but it really dispelled the whole negative influence that Yoko had over the proceedings.
Right.
It seemed perfectly cordial.
Although, what the hell is she doing there, man? Like,
but that was after George left, and they were like, "What the hell are we doing here?" You know what I mean? It wasn't like she was like, "Okay, guys, like step aside, like I'm gonna take my moment to shine." That was like a goof off moment. I think everyone was just, "Okay, this is kind of weird."
Oh, I didn't even mean on the production part of it, which I thought was fun, like, them just goofing around. And I mean, Paul seems to be having fun, jamming away, like feedbacking over her vocals and stuff, right? So, I mean, I think they're just goofing around. For me, from the very beginning, where I'm like, what the hell is Yoko doing here, was just the fact that it's like, they're improvising or whatever else. And she's just sitting there like reading a newspaper or something. It's just like, what the hell is...
Yeah, it's kind of...
What the hell is going on?
It's kind of awkward, but like...
It is weird.
Like I said, it didn't seem like anyone else really gave a crap. You know what I mean?
Well, I don't think that was the thing that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Although they, supposedly, she's even more present in like the Abbey Road recording sessions. And then, that became more problematic at some point. And I mean, Paul brings it up. I don't know if it's in the first episode or the second episode where he is having a side conversation about the whole Yoko thing. I think when John's not there, it might've been still in the first episode, but maybe it's at the beginning of the second one.
They're leaving. I think he goes, couple of the year.
Oh, it was more than that. Like John starts showing up later and later. And maybe this is at the beginning of the second episode.
I think so.
But basically, Paul is there by himself. And then Ringo shows up eventually. And Paul's just like playing the piano and, BSing with the guys around there. He starts talking about how John and Yoko are trying to, they're doing some kind of process where they need to be as close to each other at all times to like kind of, I guess there's some kind of experiment they're running on their relationship. And that's why she's just there wherever he is. She's within a few feet of him at all times. But yeah, to your point, she doesn't seem to throw out their ideas or take John's side when he's arguing with Paul. That doesn't happen at all, right? She's just there.
Yeah, she's just like in his side pocket like the whole time.
Exactly, the whole time, right?
So it's kind of funny because like Spinal Tap definitely got a lot of inspiration from, the original, whatever they saw of the original, which I'm sure those guys did. I mean, that's more contemporary to them. But she's definitely not like Michael McKean's girlfriend in Spinal Tap, who's designing costumes based on their zodiac signs. It was kind of odd, but then Linda was there too.
Linda shows up eventually. Yep.
And Ringo.
And then Ringo's wife shows up too at some point. But
so that was good because I didn't want to go in and like, oh wow, she was like, putting her foot down and like changing lyrics and stuff. It was just like, nah, she's just kind of like chilling. Another funny thing right at the beginning though, I think it was the first day where there's the Hare Krishna guy.
Yeah.
We just sit
with George.
That's almost weirder. He's like sitting 20 feet away and he's just like got his little, I don't know what he's doing in his bag there. And I think it's John who says, "What's with the little old man?" that was.
And there's two of them later on. There's two of them there.
So okay. He left and found another one, I guess. But yeah, Paul, he was trying a bit too hard, I think, and to control. He was squeezing too much, and it was coming out of his grasp, I think. Yeah. Initially. And what was kind of really interesting was I think everyone was in agreement really lamented the fact that, Brian Epstein had died.
Yes, that's what I was going to circle back to, was that Epstein dying was a huge problem for them because he was the one who kind of cracked the whip and kept them in line. They wanted to goof around and play around and be goofballs. Epstein was the one who kept them in line because he knew them since they were teenagers. And I feel like, even though you have George Martin being like, especially when they get back to the Abbey Road studios where he's like, are we going to record today? Other than that, little nudging here and there. And they do record a lot. When they get to Abbey Road, they start recording right away. So a lot of it had to do with them just not being comfortable with the space or maybe the pressure of having to do this live show or whatever that was happening. But once they get back to the studio, they start recording instantly, right? So it's much more comfortable for them. Other than George being like, all right, stop goofing around. We have to put something on tape. I think Epstein was the one, they call it out in that first episode and even more so in the second episode, where I think Paul is talking about it, saying like, he's the one who told them, you're going to change your look, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And like basically allowed them to be the goofballs that they were. And he took care of the more serious stuff and they lost that, right? And they couldn't do that part of it, and there was no one to like be their therapist when they were having these problems, right?
Yeah, I imagine that Epstein would be the guy talking with Dick James about buying this catalog of songs,
right,
and the other guys wouldn't be bothered with it.
That's why he, Lennon loved him. But then after the fact, he said some detrimental things about it when he kind of saw the way that deals had been cut after the fact, because he didn't realize like some of those merchandising deals and stuff like that, how Epstein had negotiated those because they didn't see the business side of things, right?
Yeah.
But Lennon, for example, has openly said that he had a more negative opinion of Epstein. A lot of things about Epstein they didn't realize that he was doing from a business standpoint and maybe screwed him out on some of these deals and things. On the other hand, he also said we would never have been as big as we were if it hadn't been for him, right? So it's like it's a double-edged sword with that whole relationship.
Not to cut too much slack for Epstein, but I think he was pretty down the line as far as the way management-artist relationships traditionally had been, and probably a little bit more favorable to and protective of those guys than a lot of other music managers for other folks. But yeah, I think combining the two things at the beginning that also jumped out is that, they walk in this, it's TV soundstage. It's not made for what they're trying to do. So you have that kind of uncomfortability and unfamiliarity magnified by now they're on camera. I mean, one of the first things is, you want us to turn down the amps because you couldn't hear our conversation, which goes to what you're saying, what they would do later on is play and then talk to each other. It's like, watching like a football coach with the, exactly, trying to yell at his quarterback with the playbook over his face. I guess John seemed to be having the most fun. He seemed the most laid back out of everybody, and kind of interesting at times how he was like more of a mediator than I think people would ascribe to him. He's kind of characterized as like the angry, rebellious dude that, would get into a fist fight at the drop of a hat, which on the one hand is kind of true. But in this setting, there are more than a couple times where he was like definitely trying to diffuse the situation and kind of get people on the same page. Like you were saying, when he's trying to gently tell Paul to like lay off George for a minute. And I think the thing that snapped with George too, that moment right before he left, Paul's talking with John about when to hit the chord on Get Back. And then not like minutes later, I don't know if if there was an edit in there, but I don't really think there was. He turns to George and says, don't do that. He's like, what? You just said that was the thing that we're doing. And like, so that wishy-washiness coupled with him trying to be controlling, I think was what bit Paul, because he wanted to have these fully formed ideas and control over that, but that's not the process that's going to go on in that type of situation that they've put themselves into. Ringo is just the coolest. I think we can all agree on that. There's one little snippet where I think Linda says, I feel most relaxed around Ringo.
Is the director, I think, he's like saying, I love Ringo. And she's like, she's like my favorite. He's my favorite too.
Yeah. So I think that was the consensus basically around the world.
Right.
Glenn John seemed pretty cool as a producer. It was funny because Paul kind of ribbed on him. Oh, so you're arranging the song now when they're talking about Let It Be, when he was running through that song. George Martin, his absence was conspicuous. I'm glad to hear that once we get back into Abbey Road, we'll get to see a little bit more how he worked.
Maybe it's more prevalent later, or maybe they just chose not to shoot when he was there. To your point, you don't see George Martin, that is, whatever he was doing from a production standpoint. You see him walk in every once in a while, and really like all you hear him doing is just listening in on what they're saying. And he goes, maybe you try it that way, maybe you try it that way. And then being like, are we going to record today? That's about the extent of it. As soon as they finish recording, they walk immediately into the recording studio. They bust, what's his name? Glenn's chops again. He's like dropping in and out like the guitar solo and stuff. And they're like, oh, you're arranging now? He goes, I can put it on if you want to hear it. They're like, no, go ahead, do what you're doing. Like, but they're like busting his chops for him making editorial choices. You know what I mean? So it's pretty funny to see how that plays out. But like to your point, even then they're having this banter with him, and George Martin is either just there with his arms folded listening, or he's not even in the room, it seems to be at the time, or they're not choosing to show him. So he's not really an important character in this documentary. And once again, this is a documentary that what did they shoot at the time, and then what was selectively edited. Right. Maybe that's not the dynamic they're focusing on here. But that's what I thought was interesting, like to go back to that. For me, I was watching this documentary, and first of all, I'm thinking, this is way too long. This is like, this is Peter Jackson problems all over it, because it's like everything's way too goddamn long. So I start watching it, and at first I'm like, this is all dragging on too long. And then I start thinking to myself, wait a second, now that I'm kind of just hanging out with these guys, that there's value in that. You start seeing their characters developing. Like you said, George is a little timid. John and Paul, 16 and 17, right? Yeah. And George is only 13 when they get together, right? So think about it. He's like a baby. He's like 23 years old, 24 years old when this thing's happening. Maybe that's why he's a little more timid. I think another reason there's that intimidation is that John and Paul have this like love affair, right? Like just like we've heard for decades that they are jamming with each other, and that's all they really want to do. Like they just want to make each other laugh, and they want to just write these songs together. And everybody, even Ringo and George, are just on the sidelines, right? And I think that is a frustration for George. I find that as I'm watching this documentary, I'm thinking to myself, they're shooting down George's songs, by the way, like All Things Will Pass, that, obviously ends up on his album. And when that album comes out, it's a triple album. It's like he had so many pent up songs, right? He had so many songs he wanted to explode out.
That brings me to another really cool thing. Hearing these early versions, there's a few of them that jumped out. When they did that full run through of All Things Must Pass, I'm like, dang, that would have been an awesome Beatles song. Right. It would have been, it would have had a different.
And they had no interest in it. They really were like, Paul was just like, we'll just listen to this. And they really did not feel like they even wanted to record it.
But even the half-assed version with their harmonies on it.
Yeah,
like,
still good.
That would have been really
totally
cool. Give Me Some Truth, which, later appeared on a Lennon solo album. I had no idea that, because that, to me, there's a really, to that song and that lyric is a really Lennon-driven song, which I think it was even in the early stage, but I had no idea that Paul McCartney had any involvement in writing that. And then hearing, just a little brief thing of Paul on the piano doing Another Day, which is one of his better solo. So that was really interesting to see. Yeah, the jamming and all that stuff is fun. Like, and it's been said to death about this, but it's like, oh, they're just guys being guys. You know what I mean?
Yep.
But that's kind of the thing that's cool. It does really ground them more than just being like some hagiography about, hey, how great the Beatles are.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
And that's what another thing that I kind of appreciated about what he did here. Once I got past my barrier of seeing this a traditional documentary of like this happened and this happened. When you start saying, they're like, why are we spending hours and hours watching them, literally hours watching them figure out Let It Be, or it takes over an hour of them messing around with Get Back, and then they still don't really figure it out for another whole episode of the show, which is another 2 or 3 hours of them, you hearing them jamming these songs and goofing around. I mean, wait till you see episode 2, where they literally record two of us with like, in different accents, like over and over and over again. And it's just them goofing around, right? It's actually very funny. But at the same time, the value, I think, in that is, and maybe start thinking about how difficult, to your point earlier, how difficult it is to make anything, like the way he like makes up Get Back on, by just jamming away on the guitar, and then Ringo starts playing the drums, and it's almost like how it just emerges from goofing around. So it makes you think about like how hard it is to make anything. And then at the same time, it also made me think about these people who are in that room, hearing them play the same thing 400, 500 times. like, even if it's the Beatles making their next great album, how in that moment you must feel like, I don't even know if this is going to be any good.
Yeah.
And I think that anyone who's ever tried to do anything creative, I know you do music, and I've tried to make, films and write stuff. So it's like, when you're doing it, like, you don't even know if it's going to be any good. You're just trying to get it done, because it's like, just to get it all finished already.
Yeah. To get whatever, to try and draw inspiration out, again, especially with a crazy timeline that you're bound to, is just, it's massively difficult, I think, for anybody. I did find it also interesting, which, how much they would get the melody well before the lyric, it seemed, in a lot of cases, because there's so much of it just like ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, no real words. It's all like just scatting and vocalizing or whatever. Getting that structure and then being able to fit words in there that makes sense. To go to the title of this, Get Back, I'm super glad they got away from trying to do an Enoch Powell anti-nationalism song, because that was not going in the right direction at all. Right. It kind of reminded me of Okie from Muskogee, Merle Haggard, I believe. But that's a song, that today lives on, supremely misunderstood what the lyrics are, where it's like talking about the situation. It's not satirical enough to register for most people. If they went ahead with, the no Pakistanis and Puerto Ricans, all that would have done was gotten co-opted by the Enoch Powell supporters. The sarcasm and the dismissal likely would not have registered, given the lyrics that we know were comprising that version. So I'm glad they got off that, and I'm curious to see how they evolve out of that. If anyone actually says, maybe this isn't going to sound right, or maybe it won't be well received, or the message will be kind of missed. I knew that that was kind of like the origins of that, but to actually see it, and in real time, they're reacting, I liked how they were juxtaposing all the, contemporary news clips. Right. Describing what they're talking about, which makes it make more sense. If you didn't have like that context, even if you just gave the explanation but didn't provide that additional like media, that would come off worse too. You know what I mean? I think if you're just like, really, that's how they're going to attack this problem. I would say one of the MVPs also of this is Mal Evans. He was the guy transcribing a lot of the lyrics as they're working through things. He was kind of like, I don't want to say a fixer, but he was kind of like an assistant to everyone in the band, and just seemed like a really solid dude. And like, one of the funniest moments is just the look on his face when he's playing the hammer in Maxwell. It's just, that's priceless. So big up to Mal Evans. He was a very cool guy, apparently.
Here's another realization I came to that maybe you knew about, but I didn't realize. But just speaking to the incredible clip that they were traveling at in their careers, like you said, just those 7 canonical albums, or I guess at that point they were up to 6 still, but with all the other stuff, with the Magical Mystery Tour and some of these other compilations and stuff, and just the singles, they were popping out all the time. But on top of all of that, because I'm like, wait a second, why are they playing Maxwell's Silver Hammer? In my mind, of course, Abbey Road comes before Let It Be. Maybe they're practicing them because they might perform them because they're relatively recent. And then they're like, no, they're still working at the lyrics. So I'm like, hold on a second. So I had to go to my Wikipedia article, and I'm like, so wait a second, they recorded this in January, and then they abandoned the entire album, and then they record Abbey Road like later that year. Yeah. And meanwhile, they're fracturing at this whole entire time. Already started fracturing during the White Album, from what you overhear in these conversations, especially in episode 2, by the way. You haven't gotten there yet, but they kind of lay it out that they go and talk to George, and it doesn't go well, but we don't have a recording of it. But then this is pretty funny. They go to talk. Paul and John need to talk things out. So they're like, we're going to go to the commissary and we're going to go talk. And then in the, the subtitles on the screen, it says that they went to the commissary for privacy so they could have a private conversation. They know that the filmmakers had put microphones in the vase in the table they're at. So we hear their entire conversation. Oh God. And they all lay it out. And to your point, all the things you're saying, John is like telling Paul, you're arranging in real time. You have things in your head. You're trying to force people to play what's inside your head, and you're not letting George express himself. Pretty funny, because it's like, they're having a conversation, intimate conversation that basically no one else was supposed to hear, but we get to hear it. So
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, okay, because you're a friend. how you play won't feel like you want to play. And that's what we do, and that's what you do today. Yeah. I'm not going to tell you what to play.
That seems to be the trouble, is that if you've been able to say that on the occasion, just even to say, look, I'm not going to say anything about the song because I'm going to really try now.
You know, I've always done the numbers like that. Now, the only regret about the past numbers is when, because I've been so bright, I've allowed you to take it somewhere where I didn't want. Yeah. And then that my only chance was to let George take over or interest George in it. Yeah. If you give me all suggestions, let me reject them and pinch the one I like. This is when we're writing songs. Same goes for the arranging. I don't want it to.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. And just to kind of see them at their most intimate, you know? Oh yeah. So just the chronology of it, like, they're you see that all these things are breaking apart. He references in that conversation what started happening in the White Album, where he says, we're not playing like a band anymore. We're making songs, and which is what the White Album was. My personal opinion, I know people love the White Album. For me, I think the White Album is one of their worst albums because I think it's really bloated at 2 records and it has great songs on it. But I feel like there's a bunch of John Lennon songs and they don't sound like Paul is contributing that much. And then there's a bunch of Paul songs that, honestly, those Paul songs, they sound like some of the Paul stuff I don't like later on in his career. And then there's George stuff, which I like some of George's songs on there, but they don't sound like Beatles music either, right? That sounds like George's. That just sounds like more outtakes from George's upcoming album, right?
Yeah.
So, and for me, I like that Abbey Road, really, they feel more cohesive as an album, I feel it. But anyway, my point was, I just find it fascinating that they went and recorded Abbey Road after this session. And they just went up with a whole other album, another classic album, almost simultaneously. It's pretty insane.
I think, like you said, put this in the can pretty much.
Yeah.
And it was like a couple months later, they started on Abbey Road.
Yeah, like in the summer. I mean, in the summer, I think they finished recording in the summer. So it's like, like you said, a couple months later, they're back at it doing Abbey Road.
So
in Abbey Road, they build the studio they use is like basically in the next episode when they move into Abbey Road, they don't have equipment there and they have to like build the whole studio like overnight. And that's why, that Abbey Road is the first album they fully make there and the last one pretty much too.
Yeah, it was really, really well done. I am looking forward to finishing it off. And yeah, I would say, just like you said, I was like, geez, this is 2 hours and 22 minutes.
The next episode is 3 hours long, my friend.
Well, I mean, the cool thing was, even though I did watch it in kind of 2 separate sections, overall, it didn't drag for me.
Right.
Because I just had a lot of fun, like you said, just watching their dynamics, getting to see like behind the scenes of how they interact with each other and everything like that. Even though it's super long, like Peter Jackson's want to do, I thought the pacing wasn't terrible. I think one thing that helped is always referring back to the calendar and crossing off the days. Yeah. So you at least get a sense of like, all right, where are we? Because if you didn't have that kind of demarcation, like, in your face, then it would be like, is this the same day? I mean, like,
right, exactly.
He's wearing a fur coat. Okay, it's got to be a different day, So,
they all had fur coats one day.
Yeah, and they're crazy.
Those outfits are bonkers, man. Like there's so many things that I appreciated in the documentary. Just that type of stuff, just like the crazy style of the time, and it's just so funny.
Yeah,
but. To your point about the quality of the film, I was literally watching it and I went through all these experiences of, is this too long? And I'm like, yes, it's too long. Then I changed my mind and I'm like, no, because I honestly feel at the end of that, it's like you feel like these people, like you have so much time spent with them that you start to see their personalities and you get a feel for them as actual people, not as like icons, but as like actual people. So I think there's a lot of value in that. And then I start saying, okay, even then it's only valuable as a piece of art at all because who the Beatles are, because what songs are going to be made here, right?
Oh yeah.
And then I started turning the other way, going like, well, maybe this isn't a good documentary because even though I appreciate it, actually, to your point, I don't feel it's boring, even as long as it is. I'm like, I literally am like, I have to turn this off because it's getting so late. But it's not that I was bored. What was happening was just like, I can't believe there's 2 more hours of this. How can I keep this thing going, right? But I was never bored. But then I'm thinking, but is that valuable if I wasn't a Beatles fan? But then I started coming around that again, going like, no, this is about the creative process. It's about the boring, tedious, terrible creative process that basically making something requires this much tedium and the effort. And that's the point of it, right? Like you have to hear them get it wrong 15 times and get it right once to appreciate that fact. It's not like they didn't just walk into the studio, and 10 days later, they're like, we made this album. We are geniuses, right? It's like, no, it's like this painful process with people storming out of the studio and all this. And this is what comes out of it. This is how it works.
And
right?
they clearly didn't know what they were doing like 80% of the time at the beginning.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
It is one of those things. There's such cultural touchstones. One, it's like you have a massive built-in audience that you're working with. Two, basically everyone knows the Beatles or is somewhat aware of them. So I don't see anyone that doesn't like the Beatles. They wouldn't want to watch.
This shouldn't be your intro. I would say, yeah, for sure. I think if you're not a Beatles fan, this wouldn't be your intro. But I think if you are a Beatles fan, even a marginal Beatles fan, I think you would find this utterly fascinating, right?
It's not going to convert anybody to Beatles fandom, but it's such an interesting thing for anyone that is a Beatles fan that I definitely recommend it. Since they thankfully subdivide each episode by literally crossing a day off the calendar.
Right.
You can kind of like pace yourself and, watch the first one in 3 40-minute segments or whatever.
Although I think that there is value, as far as watching it, I think there is value in trying to put yourself into those big blocks of time, because I think that is part of the effect. Like I definitely think you could break it up every single day and just kind of tune back in again if you wanted to, like you said, like watch just like 20-30-minute chapters for each one of those days. But I think there's something valuable in seeing that like drawn out 2-3 days circling around the same tune, not getting it right, feeling the tedium of that, right? Like seeing like George yawning in the background while they're trying to write Get Back, I should say, right? And seeing the effort required that this
it's kind of
that even they're bored with it. Right?
There's one I think when maybe day 3 or 4. That was the first one where John's like noticeably late. And it's, George, Paul, and Ringo. And Ringo and George are just sitting there like, okay. It's like, way too early for us on a Wednesday or whatever. But to your point, I think there is an interesting trick kind of pulled here where that tedium actually builds tension.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because you have a concrete deadline, and you're like, how are they going to pull this off now? They've wasted 6 days, and they've done 4 songs.
And knowing the songs, by the way, especially if you're a Beatles fan, knowing the songs is also a bit of suspense, because it's like when they kind of get that next part of the song, you're like, that's going to make it into the final version, right? Or they like, when they do Get Back, and then they go and they make it like a civil rights anthem, and you're like, oh no, you guys are going the wrong way. You guys are going the wrong way.
I was very thoroughly entertained. I am a huge Beatles fan anyhow, but I think just like you said, there's technically it was really well done, from a sound and visual standpoint. Yeah, I look forward to finishing it out for sure. It's really cool to see how this will play out. Like a portrait of a group that's basically they've conquered the world maybe a couple times over at this point. It's interesting to see just they're normal people, and it's a struggle to be creative at times, and it's a struggle to get along with people that you've been in close contact with for, over a decade at this point in their young lives. And the fact that they're this young, and really amazing stuff.
The thing that I find interesting, maybe you can shed some light on this, and maybe this is where we wrap it up as well. By the way, can't wait till you see the second episode, which I have seen. I haven't seen the third one yet. I'm pretty sure that the third episode is going to basically be mostly, there's going to be some lead up, but mostly the concert on the roof at the very end of the second episode. They're actually on the rooftop, like planning it out. But I'm curious to see what you think after the second episode. Billy Preston comes by and plays all those great keyboard sequences. He comes back multiple days, and of course he ends up on almost all those Let It Be tracks, classic tracks.
ladies and gentlemen, like 10.
I mean, you see what happens when we're just grooving to the music. The whole place changes.
That's all in episode 2. But the last question I was going to have for you, what I found very interesting in seeing the dynamic here among the members is, Ringo's very laid back, gets along with everybody. And George obviously has this kind of frustration. But Paul and John, even when they're at odds with each other, they never get nasty with each other. And they're so simpatico. Like I mentioned, wait till you see episode 2, where they are just committed every single day, just cracking each other up inside the studio. And you see that they still have this real love for each other. So it seems like after the fact, when you see how George collaborated with everybody and Ringo collaborated with everybody, George wrote some of his songs for him and everything when they went solo and everything after they broke up. But it seemed like Paul and John, after the breakup, did not really get along. The one thing that seems to really keep the band together is that original relationship between the two of them, and it seems to be the thing that broke up the most after the band broke up.
And there's an incident that happens that really is what kind of precipitates, like really accelerates the official dissolution of the Beatles, and that was Paul had a different person in mind to manage them than the rest of the guys did, to manage, like, I think Apple Music, but I believe one of the guys who makes an appearance here is Neil Aspinall. And then on the other side of it was a guy named Alan Klein. Paul kind of lobbied, he kind of bucked the group vote.
Is that the guy who managed the Rolling Stones?
Alan Klein? Yeah, I believe so. That, I think, and the fact that Paul also started legal action, I think those couple things really soured the relationship between him and John, because John thought that was kind of a breach of their brotherhood, essentially. And I believe that's really what drove the wedge between them post-Beatles. And you're right, because Ringo plays on Plastic Ono Band. He plays on All Things Must Pass. George plays on Imagine, not the song, but the record.
Yeah. Paul plays at the concert, right? The concert for
Bangladesh, I believe so. And so yeah, it was weird because you'd have George. Well, Ringo contributed and he got songs written by everybody. So he had like Photograph, I'm the Greatest. Photographs of Paul's song, I'm the Greatest is a John song. There's another one that George wrote for one of Ringo's first or second solo album, I think. I believe Ringo is the only one to play with all of them post Beatles, really, and then George really only played with Ringo and John. Right. And John and Paul just never had that reconciliation, which is crazy to think. If you flash forward, and I believe it's in 1980. Yeah. Right before Lennon was murdered, there's that story where Lorne Michaels wanted to get them on Saturday Night Live, and they were kind of back on speaking terms, and they legit were both in New York and thought about, let's just go down to the Saturday Night Live studios and show up. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think they were probably a little in the bag or whatever, and it was just kind of one of those flights of fancies, and they said, not that'd be fun, but not today, And unfortunately, never
missed opportunity.
Yeah. So
what's funny too is thinking about it. This is outside the context of the documentary, but it's still something that made me think about is how young they were. I'm shocked at how young people are constantly. We did our Prince retrospective. I felt the same way. I was just like, I can't believe like this guy felt like he was, like an old master and like bringing up all these people behind him, and he was like 28 years old, right? And it's the same thing here watching the Beatles, where like at the end of this incredible run, right? And they're still like some of them are. I mean, George is 25, and like I think it's crazy. I mean, when they signed their first contract with Brian Epstein, I think John was 21, and the other ones had to get their parents' permission to sign, because in England apparently you had to be under 21. You needed your parents' permission.
Yeah.
So it's the whole thing is so bananas. And this is the thing that shocked me, by the way, is when they're talking about that it was Elvis's 34th birthday, and Elvis is going to die just a few years later. In my retrospective, my recollection of when he died, I remember the news when Elvis died when I was a kid, And I thought he was this really old guy. Like he's like in his late 30s, early 40s. Like it's bananas, right?
You know, especially because they started so young, you get that sense. It's like, wow, they've been with us forever, but it's only been 9 years, and 9 years. 9 plus 21 is 30.
Yeah.
You know, 9 plus 18 is 27. You know.
Yeah.
So it's pretty crazy, and you know, yeah, I think with musicians, and that happens a lot. I mean, I know that Hendrix is in the 27 club. Right. But you take a look at him playing in his prime, and you're like, this guy's like he's like 30, right?
Right.
He's gotta be 30. No, 22.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Yeah.
Nuts.
So,
but the other thing maybe think about how young they were is how crazy, once again, in retrospect, because they have that iconic run, it's almost like, and then they were done. And and that was it. They were never going to get back together. But then you think about it, it's like, 1980, let's say they all worked it out, but specifically Paul and John worked it out, and they started to record together. I mean, a band taking like an 8-year break is not unheard of nowadays at all. Like this is very common, like the Eagles or whoever get back together 10, 15 years later. The Fleetwood Mac, how many times have they broken up and gotten back together, right? So it's like, it would be totally normal for George's, had a, huge success for a couple of albums. His career had petered off. John had never had like a huge blockbuster post Beatles career, although he had, Imagine, and he still had hits, but not anything to the level of the Beatles. And, Paul had been a very consistent hit maker, big hit songs, but none of his albums were massively successful, maybe like Band on the Run with Wings. But in general, he was, selling 1 million records here, 1 million records there. And they had all had a successful career, and they could be like, hey, let's get together and work together again. That easily could have happened.
Easily. And
everybody would have loved it, right? I mean, they would put out compilations of Beatles stuff in the 80s and 90s, and they would sell like 5-8 million copies a piece, right? So they easily could have gotten back together and done something, unfortunately it wasn't to be. So,
yeah. I mean, the other thing that I think about too, in that context is like, okay, the Rolling Stones are technically still together, but how together are you when you put out an album original material once every 13 years, which is kind of like how it's been for them over the last 2 decades or 3 decades. Only a couple like new actual releases. They're still playing shows, but it's not like they're not getting into a studio and creatively butting heads anymore. They're just going on arena tours and having a good time,
which is what they like to do. So that's fine.
More power to them. But it's it's weird, the compressed time frame, and to like step back and think about it. You're like, yeah, they could have like gotten back together for even if it was a one-off,
absolutely.
But
and not like that, not like those terrible songs off of the anthology.
Yeah, I mean, they did
Free as a Bird, and what was the other one?
Free as a Bird and Real Love.
Yes.
Which, yeah. I like the concept, but the delivery, I think something like that may be able to be pulled off better today, just given technology and audio restoration.
Right.
But that was kind of a downer. New Beatles songs, and you hear it and like, oh, that's like John's like tape recorder vocal
exactly
on his piano in like a living room. You know what I mean? I don't know, but
it's hard to believe they couldn't have found something better. Like even on like just going to get, just seeing these recordings to get back, that there's not something in there. And like you said, maybe now we have the ability to clean up some of the audio of some of those jams they had, because, you look at like Free as a Bird. First of all, the arrangement around it is so cheesy, but then they basically just have that one vocal line with him at the piano, and they're like, let's turn this into a whole song. First of all, this single is just terrible. It's just totally off topic, but to that point, it's like, I just listened to them jamming here, and they probably had 100 songs that they had half finished back at this, at their prime. Okay. And they could have easily found something, and maybe, like you said, maybe just the audio quality is not good enough. It's so funny to think about how cheap recording is now, and back then, like, wait till you see the second episode where they're literally saying, like, when they're goofing off in one of the recordings, Glenn is saying that he's going to record over it because tape is so expensive. If we're not using this take, I'm going to record over it because the tape is so expensive. It's like when you think about how crazy it is that when they had that IMAX reissue a few years back of the Moonwalk, and they had to find like the one pristine copy, like in Australia or something, and clean it up for IMAX because NBC, which had the original recordings, the masters, had taped over them for the Olympics because they're like, tape was so expensive. They're like, hey, it's just Walking on the Moon. We're gonna record the Olympics over it.
It'll happen again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I haven't gotten past the Kuiper belt since, but cool, man. Well, that was I think that was a good conversation.
I will be seeing you soon. I'll see you on Christmas probably.
Yeah, cool.
All right, man.
All right, take care.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
All right.
Isn't it a shame how we break each other's heart and cause each other pain? How we take each other's love without thinking anymore, forgetting to give back. Isn't it a pity? Some things take so long, but how do I explain? When not too many